The Desert Rose Motel sat alone on a desolate stretch of Highway 89, 20 miles outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. It was the kind of place people stopped at out of desperation rather than choice, a relic from the 1960s that had somehow survived into the present despite its peeling paint, flickering neon sign, and parking lot full of potholes. The single-story building formed an L shape around a cracked concrete courtyard where a defunct swimming pool had been filled with dirt and weeds. Only 8 rooms remained operational, their numbers fading on doors that hadn't been painted in decades. Jason Mercer pulled his battered Ford pickup into the parking lot just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if he'd been in the mindset to appreciate them. At 34 years old, Jason looked older, his face lined beyond his years, his eyes carrying the thousand-yard stare that marked men who'd seen too much combat. His dark hair, cropped military short out of habit, was beginning to show gray at the temples. He wore faded jeans and a plain gray t-shirt that hung loose on his frame. He'd been driving for 3 days straight, running from memories that followed him like shadows, trying to outpace the nightmares that turned every night into a battlefield. The VA had diagnosed him with severe PTSD 2 years ago after his third deployment to Afghanistan, but diagnosis didn't equal cure, and the medications they'd prescribed made him feel like he was moving underwater, disconnected from reality in ways that sometimes felt worse than the flashbacks. So he'd stopped taking them 6 months ago and started driving instead, crisscrossing the country with no destination in mind. The motel office was dim and smelled of stale cigarettes and pine air freshener that had long since lost its battle against decay. An older woman with badly dyed red hair sat behind a scratched plexiglass window, watching a soap opera on a small television with terrible reception. She barely glanced at Jason as he approached. $65 for the night, cash only, checkouts at 10, she recited in a monotone voice that suggested she'd said these words thousands of times. Jason pulled crumpled bills from his wallet and slid them under the window. Room 7, the woman said, pushing a physical key across the counter. Not a key card, but an actual brass key attached to a plastic diamond with the room number printed on it. No smoking inside, no visitors after midnight, and the water takes a minute to get hot. Jason took the key without comment, his minimal interaction with other humans, a skill he'd perfected over the past 2 years. People asked questions, wanted to know your story, expected emotional responses he no longer had the energy to manufacture. Silence was easier, safer, less likely to trigger the panic that sometimes gripped his chest without warning. Room 7 was exactly what Jason expected. A double bed with a faded floral bedspread, a nightstand with a lamp that flickered when turned on, a television bolted to a dresser, and a bathroom visible through an open door that revealed tiles that had once been white but were now yellowed with age. The carpet was worn thin in traffic patterns, and the window air conditioning unit rattled when he turned it on, producing a weak stream of cool air that barely made a dent in the desert heat that had soaked into the walls all day. He dropped his duffel bag on the bed and stood in the center of the room, feeling the familiar emptiness settle over him. This was his life now. Anonymous motel rooms, highways that all looked the same, gas station food, and the constant effort to stay one step ahead of his own mind. The VA therapist had told him he was isolating, that he needed connection and community to heal, but she hadn't understood that connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. It was easier to be alone, to not care about anyone or anything, to exist in a liminal space between past trauma and an uncertain future. He hadn't spoken to his family in over a year, ignoring their calls and texts until they'd finally stopped reaching out. Jason had just pulled off his boots and was considering whether he had the energy to find food when he heard it, a sound that cut through the motel's ambient noise of traffic and humming air conditioners like a knife. It was a thud, heavy and deliberate, followed by another, then what sounded like a muffled cry. His body responded before his conscious mind caught up, muscle memory from years of combat dropping him into a crouch, adrenaline flooding his system, his heartbeat accelerating. For a moment he was back in Kandahar, listening to the sounds of an ambush forming in the darkness outside the compound walls. He forced himself to breathe, to ground himself in the present. This wasn't Afghanistan. This was a motel in Arizona. The sounds were coming from room 6, directly adjacent to his own. Another thud, louder this time, followed by what was unmistakably a child's voice, high-pitched and terrified, though the words were muffled by the wall between them. Jason's hands began to shake, but not from fear exactly, rather from the conflict between his trained response to threat and his desperate desire to remain disconnected from the world's problems. This wasn't his business. He should ignore it, turn on the television to drown out the sounds. But then came a crash, the sound of something shattering, and a man's voice raised in incoherent shouting, the words bleeding together into a stream of rage. More crying, 2 distinct voices this time, children, plural, and the sound of someone moving quickly, furniture scraping against the floor. Jason's jaw clenched. Every instinct honed by 8 years in the Marines was screaming at him that someone was in danger, that the pattern of sounds indicated violence, that intervention was necessary. His therapist's voice echoed in his head. Sometimes the way through trauma is to help others, to channel what happened to you into preventing it from happening to someone else. Jason moved to his door and opened it carefully, stepping out into the courtyard. The evening air was still warm, carrying the scent of creosote bushes from the surrounding desert. Room 6 was 3 doors down from his, its windows blocked by heavy curtains that allowed no view inside, but the sounds were clearer out here. Another thud, followed by a child's scream that was quickly cut off, and then the man's voice again, ranting about demons, about corruption, about things that needed to be purged. The words were disjointed, paranoid, the speech pattern of someone not in touch with reality, possibly high or experiencing a psychotic break. Jason found himself moving toward room 6 before he'd consciously decided to do so. His hand reached out and knocked on the door, 3 sharp raps. "Hey, everything okay in there?" His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rusty from disuse. The sounds inside immediately stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse than the noise. Jason knocked again, "Just checking if you need anything." No response. He tried the handle, but it was locked. Through the door, he could hear whispered movement, then the man's voice, low and menacing, saying something he couldn't make out. Jason pulled out his cell phone, one of the few connections to society he maintained because even he recognized that complete isolation wasn't practical. His thumb hovered over the screen as he debated. Getting involved meant dealing with police, questions, potential attention he didn't want. But not getting involved meant walking away from children in danger, and despite his desire to disconnect from the world, he found he couldn't do that. With a heavy breath, he dialed 911. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, grounding. Jason cleared his throat. "I'm at the Desert Rose Motel on Highway 89, room 7. There's a situation in room 6. Sounds like children being hurt. Adult male, sounds unstable, possibly violent." He kept his voice low, moving away from the door. The dispatcher's keyboard clicked in the background. "Sir, can you describe what you're hearing?" Jason detailed the thuds, the crying, the man's erratic shouting. "Officers are being dispatched now. ETA approximately 8 minutes. Sir, are you in a safe location?" Jason glanced at room 6's door. "For now, I'm outside, in the courtyard. I'll stay on the line." "That's good, sir. What's your name?" The question was standard protocol, but it made Jason tense. "Jason Mercer." Another pause. "Mr. Mercer, I need you to maintain your distance from room 6. Don't attempt to enter or engage. Are there other occupied rooms nearby?" Jason scanned the parking lot. Only 3 cars besides his own, scattered across the lot. "Doesn't look like it. Place is mostly empty." The dispatcher acknowledged this. "Officers are 4 minutes out. Stay on the line with me and let me know immediately if the situation escalates." The 4 minutes felt like hours. Jason positioned himself behind a concrete pillar that supported the motel's roof overhang, giving him cover while maintaining a visual on room 6's door. Training he thought he'd left behind in the Marines resurfaced, assess the environment, identify escape routes, anticipate threats. The motel office was 50 feet away, the highway beyond that. The desert stretched out behind the building, offering open ground but no real cover. If things went wrong, if the man inside decided to come out armed, Jason's options would be limited. His heart rate had stabilized into the controlled rhythm of pre-combat readiness. Inside room 6, the sounds had changed. The thuds had stopped, but now Jason could hear the man's voice in what might have been prayer or incantation, a rapid-fire monologue that rose and fell in pitch. Occasionally, a child's whimper would break through, quickly hushed. Jason's jaw tightened. Those kids had been silent for too long, which either meant they'd been effectively intimidated into submission or something worse. His hands curled into fists, nails digging into his palms, using the physical pain to keep himself anchored in the present, and not spiraling into memories of other children in other places he hadn't been able to save. Sirens cut through the desert evening, growing louder. Jason saw the flash of red and blue lights before the patrol cars came into view, 2 of them pulling into the parking lot with practiced precision. A third vehicle followed, marked K9 unit on the side. Officers emerged quickly, hands on weapons but not drawn, their body language alert but controlled. The lead officer, a woman in her mid-30s with her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, made a beeline for Jason after a quick scan of the scene. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Officer Lisa Hartley. You made the call?" Jason nodded, pointing to room 6. "That one. Man inside with at least 2 kids from what I can hear. He's been violent, hitting something or someone, kids crying. His speech is erratic, paranoid, talking about demons, possibly drugs or a mental health crisis." Officer Hartley's expression tightened. Have you had any visual confirmation? Jason shook his head. No, doors locked, curtains closed, but the sounds are clear. Hartley turned to her fellow officers, giving quick, efficient orders. One moved to evacuate the motel office, another positioned himself at the corner of the building with a clear line of sight to room 6's door. The K-9 officer approached, a tall man with graying hair and the solid build of someone who'd been in law enforcement for decades. Officer Mike Chen, he introduced himself. This is Rex. The German Shepherd at his side was magnificent, all black except for tan markings on his legs and face, his dark eyes intelligent and alert. Rex wore a working vest with Police K-9 emblazoned on the sides. Rex is trained in threat assessment and emotional atmospheric detection. He can read stress levels and identify the presence of multiple individuals through doors. Mind if we get closer? Jason stepped aside, watching as Officer Chen and Rex approached room 6. The dog's demeanor changed as they neared the door, his body tensing, his head lowering slightly. He sniffed along the door's bottom edge, then suddenly began scratching at it with his front paws, a low growl building in his chest. It wasn't the aggressive growl of a dog preparing to attack, but something else, something urgent and insistent. Chen's hand tightened on the leash. He's detecting high stress, multiple individuals, and elevated threat level. This is his hostage situation response. Someone in there is in immediate danger. Officer Hartley made a decision. Mr. Mercer, I need you to go to the parking lot behind the patrol cars and stay there. She turned to her team. We're going to make contact. Chen, have Rex ready. Johnson, you're with me on the door. She approached room 6 and knocked with authority. This is the Flagstaff Police Department. We need you to open the door and speak with us. Silence, then shuffling movement. A male voice strained and suspicious. Go away. You're part of it. You're all part of the contamination. The words were slurred, speech patterns consistent with stimulant use. Sir, we just want to make sure everyone is okay. Are there children in there with you? Hartley's voice remained calm, non-confrontational. They're mine! My babies! I'm protecting them from the demons, from the poison you people put in everything. The man's voice rose to a shout. You can't have them! I see through your lies! There was a crash, something thrown against the door from inside, making several officers flinch. Rex's growling intensified, his body coiled like a spring. Chen whispered something to the dog, and Rex settled slightly but remained fixated on the door. Sir, no one wants to take your children. We're just concerned about their safety. Can you open the door so we can talk face to face? Hartley was trying the negotiation approach, but Jason could see from his position behind the patrol cars that she was also signaling for her team to prepare for forced entry. Another officer had retrieved a battering ram from one of the vehicles, holding it ready but out of sight of the door. The standoff continued for several minutes, with Hartley trying to establish dialogue while the man inside became increasingly agitated, his responses less coherent. Then a new sound emerged, a child's voice, small and terrified, calling out, "Help us! Please help!" before being abruptly silenced. That was the trigger. Hartley gave a sharp nod, and the officer with the battering ram moved into position. Sir, this is your last chance to open the door voluntarily. If you don't open it in 10 seconds, we're coming in. 10, 9. She counted down clearly, giving the man every opportunity to comply. But when she reached 0 and the door remained closed, she stepped aside and gave the order. Breach! The battering ram struck the door just beside the lock, and the old wood frame splintered immediately. The door flew inward, and officers poured into the room with Rex and Chen close behind. Jason found himself moving forward despite the earlier order to stay back, his body acting on combat instincts. From outside he could hear shouting, officers giving commands, the man's voice screaming incoherently, and then a single gunshot that made Jason's heart stop. His mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario, images of dead children flooding his consciousness, triggering memories he'd spent 2 years trying to bury. But then came the sounds of a struggle, multiple voices shouting, "Drop the weapon! Drop it now! Hands where I can see them!" followed by Rex's aggressive barking and the heavy sound of someone being taken to the ground. More shouting, the ratchet of handcuffs being applied, and finally, Officer Chen's voice. "Clear! We've got him! Someone check the bathroom!" Jason remained frozen in place, his breathing shallow, his vision narrowing to a tunnel. The therapist had called this a flashback trigger, but knowing what it was didn't make it easier to control. He forced himself to focus on his surroundings, the desert air, the smell of creosote, the flickering neon sign of the motel. Officer Hartley emerged from the room, her face grim, and immediately spotted Jason despite his attempt to remain unobtrusive. "Mr. Mercer, I need you to stay back." But her attention was already divided as she spoke into her radio, calling for CPS, for paramedics, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Behind her, Officer Johnson appeared in the doorway, holding something carefully. A child, a little boy perhaps 5 years old, thin and pale with dark hair matted against his head. He was crying silently, tears streaming down a face marked with bruises, his small body trembling. Johnson carried him with extreme gentleness, murmuring reassurances. Chen emerged next with Rex still at his side, and following them was another officer carrying a second child, a girl who looked identical to the boy, clearly twins. She had the same dark hair, the same thin frame, the same bruises, and the same expression of absolute terror. Both children were dressed in dirty pajamas, and even from a distance Jason could see they were malnourished, their collarbones and ribs too prominent. The girl was clutching something, a stuffed animal so worn it was barely recognizable, holding it against her chest like a shield. Both children flinched at every sound, every movement, their eyes darting constantly. The man was brought out next, restrained by two officers, and Jason got his first clear look at the suspect. He was younger than his voice had suggested, maybe late 20s, but ravaged by substance abuse. His eyes were wild, pupils dilated to the point where almost no iris was visible, his skin covered in sores consistent with methamphetamine use. He was screaming about demons and contamination, his words a paranoid stream of consciousness that made no logical sense. A gun, a small revolver, hung from an evidence bag in one officer's hand, thankfully not fired except for the single shot that had gone into the ceiling, a discharge that appeared accidental. The chaos of the scene washed over Jason in waves. Officers were establishing a perimeter, photographers were documenting evidence, the motel manager had emerged and was talking rapidly with someone, gesturing emphatically. Paramedics had arrived and were trying to assess the twins, but both children were completely unresponsive, frozen in shock. The boy stared straight ahead at nothing, while the girl had pulled into herself, curling around her stuffed animal. When a paramedic tried to examine the boy's bruises, he flinched so violently he nearly fell, and when someone reached for the girl, she let out a sound of pure terror. Rex, who had been standing near Officer Chen receiving praise for his work, suddenly pulled toward the twins with surprising force. Chen looked surprised but allowed the dog to lead, and Rex moved directly to where the children sat on the ground, having refused to get on the stretchers. The German shepherd's entire demeanor changed, his earlier aggressive alertness transforming into something gentle, almost careful. He approached the twins slowly, his body language submissive, non-threatening, his tail giving a slight wag. The boy noticed first, his vacant stare focusing on the dog with something like recognition. Rex settled into a sitting position directly in front of the twins, close but not touching, and simply waited. The change in the children was subtle at first, the boy's hand slowly uncurling from the fist it had been clenched in, the girl's breathing becoming slightly less rapid. Then the boy reached out tentatively, his small hand extending toward Rex's head, and when his fingers made contact with the dog's fur, something broke inside him. He leaned forward suddenly, wrapping his thin arms around Rex's neck, and began to sob, deep wrenching sounds that came from somewhere fundamental. The dog remained perfectly still, accepting the embrace, his tail wagging slowly. The girl watched this for a long moment, then shifted closer, her hand reaching out to touch Rex's shoulder. The stuffed animal fell from her grip as she too leaned into the dog, her small fingers stroking his neck. She whispered something too quiet for anyone else to hear, then repeated it louder. "You're not like Daddy. You don't yell." Her voice was thin, damaged from screaming or crying or both, but the words carried clearly through the courtyard. Rex shifted carefully, positioning himself so both children could maintain contact, his patience and gentleness a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding them. Jason found himself moving forward again, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. He stopped at what he judged was a respectful distance, close enough to hear but far enough not to intrude. The boy had released his grip on Rex slightly and was looking around with more awareness, his eyes eventually landing on Jason. There was a moment of connection, one traumatized soul recognizing another, and Jason felt something crack inside his carefully constructed walls. He knelt down slowly, bringing himself to the children's level, and when the boy didn't look away, he spoke quietly. "I know what it's like to hide from someone who was supposed to protect you." The words came out before Jason fully realized he was going to say them, a truth he'd never spoken aloud to anyone, not even his therapist. "I know what it's like to be so scared you can't breathe, and to think no one's ever going to find you, and to wonder if maybe it's your fault somehow." The girl's eyes had shifted to him now, both twins watching him with an intensity that was almost painful. Jason swallowed hard. "But it's not your fault. None of this is your fault. And these people, these officers, they're here to keep you safe now." Officer Hartley approached carefully, having observed the interaction. "Mr. Mercer, you served, didn't you?" It wasn't really a question. She could read the signs just as he could read threat patterns. Jason nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement. "Marines, 3 tours in Afghanistan." Hartley's expression softened slightly. "Thank you for making that call. If you hadn't, we might not have found these kids until it was too late. The father had a loaded gun and was experiencing a severe psychotic episode induced by methamphetamine. He was minutes away from doing something irreversible. The weight of that statement settled over Jason. He'd spent 2 years running from responsibility, from connection, from the idea that he could make a difference, and yet here, in this rundown motel in the middle of nowhere, his actions had directly prevented a tragedy. The irony wasn't lost on him. The paramedics made another attempt to approach the twins, and this time, with Rex staying close and Jason remaining nearby, the children allowed themselves to be examined. The assessment was grim. Multiple bruises in various stages of healing, signs of malnutrition and dehydration, psychological trauma that would require extensive therapy. The boy, who had remained largely silent except for his initial sobbing, suddenly spoke to Jason directly. "Are you a soldier?" His voice was small but curious, cutting through his fear. Jason met his eyes. "I was. Not anymore." The boy processed this. "Did you fight bad guys?" Jason's jaw tightened, memories threatening to surface, but he pushed them down. "Yeah, I did." The boy nodded as if this confirmed something. "Can you fight our daddy? He says he's going to come back and finish what he started." The fear in his voice was palpable, and the girl whimpered, pressing closer to Rex. Officer Hartley intervened gently. "Your daddy is going to jail for a very long time. He can't hurt you anymore. You're both safe now." But the children looked skeptical, the kind of skepticism that comes from repeated promises that have been broken. Jason understood that too, the inability to trust that safety was real, that it would last. He'd felt that way constantly since leaving the service, waiting for the next explosion, the next ambush, the next betrayal. "What are your names?" he asked quietly. The boy glanced at his sister, then back to Jason. "I'm Alex. She's Emma. We're 6. 6 years old and already carrying trauma that would shape their entire lives. Jason felt anger boiling up inside him, a clean, focused rage at the man who had done this to his own children, who had turned their home into a war zone. It was an echo of the anger he felt toward his own father, a man who'd never physically abused him but whose emotional violence had been devastating in its own way. The therapist had tried to help him work through that, but Jason had built walls instead, convincing himself that not feeling anything was better than feeling everything. Looking at Alex and Emma, he realized how wrong he'd been. The CPS worker arrived, a harried-looking woman in her 50s named Margaret, who had the exhausted demeanor of someone who'd seen too many cases like this. She approached the twins carefully, introducing herself and explaining that she was going to help find them a safe place to stay. Alex and Emma clung to Rex, unwilling to let go, and Margaret looked at Officer Chen questioningly. "Is there any way the dog can come with us, at least to the hospital for the initial exam? They've bonded with him, and it might make the transition easier." Chen looked at Rex, then at the children, then nodded. "Yeah, I can make that work." The next few hours were a blur of bureaucracy and procedure. Jason gave his formal statement to Officer Hartley, detailing everything he'd heard and observed. The father, identified as Marcus Webb, was taken into custody and would face multiple charges including child abuse, child endangerment, reckless discharge of a firearm, and possession of controlled substances. His meth-induced psychosis had convinced him that his children were possessed by demons and needed to be purged, a delusion that had nearly proven fatal. The motel room had revealed a nightmare, the bathroom where the twins had been locked, zip ties used as restraints, and evidence of systematic abuse. Jason expected to be dismissed once his statement was complete, to return to room 7, pack his bag, and continue his aimless journey. But Officer Hartley stopped him as he turned to leave. "Mr. Mercer, the twins have been asking for you. I know you probably want to get back to your evening, but would you be willing to come to the hospital with us? You seem to have made a connection with them, and right now they're not trusting any adults except you and Officer Chen. It might help them cooperate with the medical exam." Jason hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to decline, to maintain his isolation, to not get involved. But then he thought about Alex and Emma, about how their eyes had looked when they'd been brought out of that room, about the way they'd clung to Rex like he was the only safe thing in a world gone mad. He thought about his own childhood, the fear and confusion, and how desperately he'd wanted someone, anyone, to see what was happening and care enough to intervene. "Yeah," he heard himself say. "I'll come." Hartley's expression showed relief, and something else, maybe respect. "Thank you. My car is over here." The drive to Flagstaff Medical Center was quiet, Jason sitting in the back of the patrol car, watching the desert landscape blur past in the growing darkness. At the hospital, Alex and Emma were in a pediatric examination room with Rex lying on the floor between them, his presence the only thing keeping them calm enough for the doctors to work. When Jason entered, both children's faces lit up with relief, and Alex immediately reached out his hand. "You came," he said as if he'd expected to be abandoned. Jason took the small hand carefully. I said I would. Emma looked up at him with those haunted eyes. Are you going to stay? Everyone always leaves. The weight of that statement, the resignation in a 6-year-old's voice, hit Jason harder than any IED ever had. I'll stay as long as you need me to, Jason promised, and meant it, even though he had no idea how he was going to keep that promise or what it would mean for his carefully constructed isolation. The medical examination took hours, documenting every injury, every sign of neglect and abuse. The twins had been living in that motel room for 3 weeks, Marcus having taken them from their mother's home during what was supposed to be a supervised visit. The mother, investigators would later discover, had been frantically searching for them, filing missing person reports that had somehow fallen through the cracks in an overloaded system. Dr. Rachel Foster, the pediatrician handling the case, pulled Margaret and Officer Hartley aside, her expression grave. These children have been through severe trauma. The physical injuries will heal, but the psychological damage is extensive. They'll need specialized trauma therapy, possibly residential treatment initially, and long-term support. They're also showing signs of PTSD, which at their age can manifest differently than in adults, but is no less serious. I'm recommending immediate placement in a trauma-informed therapeutic foster home, and I'm going to be very picky about where they go. Margaret nodded, already making calls on her phone, searching through her database of approved foster homes that could handle high-needs cases. Jason, sitting with the twins while they underwent yet another assessment, found himself thinking about his own PTSD, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way loud noises sent him diving for cover. He'd been an adult when his trauma occurred, trained and prepared in some ways, and it had still nearly destroyed him. Alex and Emma were 6, their entire worldview shaped by violence and fear. How did children recover from that? Could they recover from that? The questions circled in his mind like vultures. Emma had fallen asleep against Jason's side, exhausted beyond her ability to remain conscious, her small body finally succumbing to the crash that followed sustained terror. Alex remained awake, watching Rex with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every detail, perhaps afraid he'd never see the dog again. Mr. Jason, he said quietly, using the title the nurses had given him when introducing them. Where are we going to go? It was the question Jason had been dreading. I don't know yet, buddy, but Ms. Margaret is finding you somewhere safe, somewhere your dad can't reach you. Alex considered this. Will you be there? The question was simple but loaded with desperation, the need for something, someone, familiar in a world that had been torn apart. Jason looked at the boy, at his sister sleeping trustingly against a stranger's side, at Rex, who had given these children the first moment of calm they'd probably experienced in weeks, and felt something shifting inside him. He'd spent 2 years running, convinced he had nothing to offer anyone, that he was too broken to be of use. But here, in this hospital room, 2 children needed him in a way that was immediate and undeniable. I don't know if they'll let me, Jason said honestly. I'm not family, and I don't have any official role here, but I promise I'll try to stay close, to check on you, to make sure you're okay. Alex's face fell slightly, but he nodded, a child learning early that adults often promise things they couldn't deliver. The moment was interrupted by Margaret returning with news. I've found a placement, she announced, though her tone was less than enthusiastic. The Montgomery family, about an hour from here. They're experienced with trauma cases and have room for twins. It's not ideal, but it's the best option available on short notice. Officer Hartley looked at her questioningly. Why not ideal? Margaret sighed. They're good people, certified and trained, but they already have 3 other foster children, and their facility is more institutional than I'd like for kids this young. However, it's that or emergency shelter care, and shelter would be worse. I've requested a priority review for more permanent placement, but that could take weeks. She looked at Jason. Mr. Mercer, I appreciate what you've done tonight, but from here, we'll need to follow protocol. The children will be transported to their foster placement, where they'll be under the care of trained professionals. Jason nodded, understanding the unspoken message. His involvement ended here. Alex had been listening, his young face processing the information with a maturity that no 6-year-old should possess. Can Rex come? He asked, his voice small. Officer Chen, who had been standing quietly in the corner, moved forward. Buddy, Rex is a working dog. He has a job with the police department, and he can't live at the foster home. But maybe we can arrange visits. He looked at Margaret questioningly. Margaret's expression was doubtful. That would be irregular, and we'd need permission from multiple agencies. I'll make it happen, Officer Hartley interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. These kids have been through hell. If a dog can help them feel safe, I'll personally ensure visits are arranged. Chen nodded his agreement, and Rex, as if understanding the conversation, moved closer to the twins, allowing both Alex and sleeping Emma to touch him. The bureaucratic machinery ground on. Forms were filled out, protocols were followed, and arrangements were made. Jason was asked to step into the hallway while Margaret spoke with the twins about what would happen next, preparing them for the transition to the foster home. Officer Hartley joined Jason in the hallway, 2 cups of terrible hospital coffee in her hands. She offered him one, and they stood together in silence for a moment. "You did good tonight," she finally said. "A lot of people would have turned up the TV and tried to ignore it, convinced themselves it wasn't their problem. You didn't." Jason stared into the coffee. "I almost did. Stood there for a solid minute trying to talk myself out of calling." Hartley smiled slightly. "But you didn't. That's what matters. You know, we could use people like you. The department has a civilian volunteer program, crisis intervention team members who help with situations like this." Jason shook his head. "I'm not in a place to help anyone. I can barely keep myself together." Hartley studied him with the practiced eye of someone who dealt with veterans before. "PTSD," Jason nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement. "Severe, according to the VA. Nightmares, hypervigilance, panic attacks, the whole package. I'm not exactly stable." Hartley sipped her coffee. "And yet tonight, in a crisis, you stayed calm, assessed the situation, called for help, and then provided exactly what those kids needed. Sounds pretty stable to me. Maybe you're more functional than you think." The comment lingered in Jason's mind as he was eventually, reluctantly, separated from Alex and Emma. The twins were wrapped in blankets provided by the hospital, clutching new stuffed animals donated by a children's charity, and loaded into Margaret's car for transport to the Montgomery foster home. Alex looked back at Jason through the rear window, his small face pressed against the glass, and Jason felt something in his chest constrict painfully. He raised his hand in a wave, and Alex waved back before the car turned a corner and disappeared from view. The sudden absence left Jason standing alone in the hospital parking lot, feeling untethered. Officer Chen approached with Rex at his side. "You made an impact tonight," he said simply. "Those kids will remember you. Might not seem like much now, but trust me, in trauma recovery, every positive connection matters." Jason looked down at Rex, who sat calmly, his intelligent eyes seeming to assess Jason with the same intensity he'd shown in the motel courtyard. "How does he do it?" Jason asked. "Red people like that? Know who needs help?" Chen smiled. "Training, instinct, and something else I can't quite explain. Rex has this ability to sense emotional distress. We call it atmospheric detection, but really it's more like empathy. He knows when someone is hurting." As if to demonstrate, Rex stood and moved closer to Jason, pressing his solid body against Jason's leg, the same gesture of comfort he'd offered the twins. The contact was grounding in a way Jason hadn't experienced in years. "He does this with everyone?" Jason asked, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on Rex's head. Chen shook his head. "No, actually. Rex is selective about who he offers comfort to. He doesn't react this way to everyone we encounter. He sees something in you, same as he saw in those kids. Recognizes a fellow survivor, maybe." The comment hit closer to home than Chen probably realized. Jason spent that night back at the Desert Rose Motel, though not in room 7. The manager had offered him room 3 on the opposite side of the complex from room 6, which was now sealed with police tape and marked as an active crime scene. He lay in another anonymous bed, staring at another water-stained ceiling, but this time his mind wasn't cycling through combat memories. Instead, he thought about Alex and Emma, wondered if they were sleeping or lying awake in a strange place, terrified. He thought about the promise he'd made to stay close, to check on them, and realized with surprise that he actually wanted to keep it. The next morning, Jason made a series of phone calls, starting with Margaret from CPS. He explained that he wanted to maintain contact with the twins, to perhaps visit if that was allowed, to be a consistent presence during their recovery. Margaret was initially hesitant, citing protocols and regulations, but when Jason mentioned his own experience with PTSD and his understanding of trauma, she softened. "The Montgomery placement is temporary, a few weeks at most, while we search for something better. The twins are having a hard time adjusting, lots of nightmares, refusing to eat. Officer Chen brought Rex by yesterday afternoon, and it helped, but they keep asking for you." "Can I visit?" Jason asked directly. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Technically, you'd need to go through our volunteer screening process, background checks, training. That takes weeks normally. But given the circumstances and the fact that you've already been cleared by the police investigation, I might be able to expedite. Let me make some calls." Jason gave her his contact information, then sat in his truck in the motel parking lot, unsure what to do with himself. For 2 years, he'd drifted with no direction, no purpose, no reason to be in one place rather than another. Now, suddenly, he had a reason to stay, at least for a while. Officer Hartley called next with an unexpected proposition. Mr. Mercer, I meant what I said about the Civilian Crisis Intervention Program. We're actually starting a new initiative specifically focused on veteran peer support, helping other vets in crisis situations. You'd undergo training, ride along with officers on certain calls, provide a peer perspective. It's volunteer, no pay, but there are benefits, structure, purpose, connection to community. Interested? Jason's immediate instinct was to decline, to retreat back into isolation, but he found himself hesitating. Can I think about it? He asked. Hartley agreed, giving him her direct number. 3 days later, Jason received clearance to visit the twins at the Montgomery foster home. The house was large and well-maintained, converted from an old farmhouse to accommodate multiple children. Inside, it was clean but institutional, with durable furniture and decorations that aimed for cheerful but landed on generic. A woman in her 50s, Mrs. Montgomery, greeted Jason with professional warmth. The twins are in the playroom. They've been very withdrawn, Mr. Mercer. We've been working on basic trust building, but it's slow going. They light up whenever we mention your name or talk about another visit from Officer Chen's dog. Alex and Emma were sitting together in a corner of the playroom, building blocks scattered around them but largely ignored. They looked small and lost among the colorful toys and other children. When Jason entered, both their heads snapped up simultaneously, and Alex scrambled to his feet, running across the room. "You came back!" The relief and joy in his voice made Jason's throat tighten. Emma followed more slowly, clutching a new stuffed dog that looked remarkably like Rex, and when she reached Jason, she wrapped her thin arms around his leg and held on like she might be torn away at any moment. "I said I would," Jason said, kneeling down to their level. The visit lasted 2 hours, and Jason found himself opening up to the twins in ways he hadn't with anyone else. He told them simplified versions of his experiences, how loud noises sometimes scared him, how he had bad dreams about things that happened far away, how he knew what it felt like to be afraid all the time. Alex listened with the intensity of someone much older. "Does it get better?" he asked quietly. Jason considered lying, offering false reassurance, but decided these kids deserved honesty. "It gets different," he said. "Some days are harder than others, but you learn ways to cope and you find people who understand, and slowly it gets a little easier." Emma, who had been mostly silent, suddenly spoke up. "Daddy said we were bad, that we had demons." Her voice was tiny, broken. "Said that's why Mommy didn't want us, why nobody wanted us." Jason felt rage coursing through him, but he kept his voice gentle. "Your daddy was wrong. Very, very wrong. You're not bad. You don't have demons. Your daddy was sick in his mind, and he said things that weren't true. Your mommy has been looking for you every single day since you disappeared, and she definitely wants you. You're going to see her soon." That last part was information Margaret had shared, that the children's mother had been located and was undergoing evaluation for reunification. The visits became regular, 3 times a week at first, then more frequently as the days passed. Jason found himself anticipating them, planning what he might do or say, wanting to be someone these kids could count on. Officer Chen arranged for Rex to visit as well, and those were the times when Alex and Emma seemed most like normal children, laughing as Rex performed simple tricks, relaxing into the dog's steady presence. Jason and Chen developed an unexpected friendship, 2 men with very different backgrounds, but a shared understanding of service and its costs. Chen had been a Marine too, 2 decades earlier, and he recognized in Jason the signs of a man at a crossroads. "You thinking about Hartley's offer?" Chen asked one afternoon as they watched the twins play with Rex in the Montgomery's backyard. Jason had been thinking about it constantly. "Part of me wants to. Part of me thinks I'm too messed up to be helpful to anyone." Chen smiled. "You know what I've learned? The people who've been through hell are often the best at helping others walk through it. You speak the language of trauma in a way that someone with textbook knowledge never will. These kids respond to you because you get it, really get it. Other people in crisis would respond the same way." The words settled over Jason, taking root. On the 15th day after the motel incident, Margaret called with news. The twins' mother, Sharon Webb, had been cleared for reunification. She'd separated from Marcus years ago due to his escalating substance abuse and violence, had a restraining order that he'd violated when he kidnapped the children, and had been frantically searching for them, working with police in multiple states. She was stable, employed, living in a safe home in New Mexico, and desperate to have her children back. The reunification would be gradual, starting with supervised visits, but the ultimate goal was for Alex and Emma to return to their mother's care within the month. "How are they taking it?" Jason asked. Margaret's tone was cautious. "Mixed. They're happy about seeing their mother, but they're also scared of leaving the people they've started to trust here. They're worried you and Officer Chen and Rex won't be part of their lives anymore if they move to New Mexico." I assured them that's not how it works, that the connections they've made don't just disappear, but at their age, object permanence is still developing. What they can't see, they have trouble believing exists. Jason understood that fear intimately, the sense that every good thing was temporary, that loss was inevitable. The day Sharon Webb arrived for her first visit with the twins was emotionally charged. Jason was there, at Margaret's request, to help facilitate the transition. Sharon was a thin woman in her early 30s with the same dark hair as her children and eyes that carried years of worry and pain. When she saw Alex and Emma, she dropped to her knees and opened her arms, and after a moment's hesitation, both children ran to her. The reunion was tearful, Sharon sobbing as she held her children, checking them over, whispering apologies and promises. Alex and Emma clung to her but kept looking back at Jason as if needing reassurance that this was okay. "You can go to your mom," Jason said gently. "It's safe. She's here to take care of you." Sharon looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "You're Jason? Margaret told me about you, about what you did. Thank you doesn't even begin to cover it. You saved my babies." Jason shook his head. "I just made a phone call. The officers did the real work." Sharon stood, still holding Emma, and moved closer. "You did more than that. Margaret says you've been visiting, that you've helped them start to heal. That's not just a phone call. That's showing up consistently for children who aren't yours. That's heroic." Over the following weeks, the reunification process progressed smoothly. Sharon relocated temporarily to Flagstaff to make the transition easier, finding a small apartment where the twins could visit for increasing lengths of time before the permanent move to New Mexico. Jason continued his visits, now including Sharon, helping her understand what her children had been through and what they might need going forward. He shared resources about childhood PTSD, recommended therapists who specialize in trauma, and offered his own experiences as a framework for understanding the long recovery ahead. Sharon absorbed everything like a sponge, determined to do right by her children after the horror they'd endured. Jason had made his decision about Officer Hartley's offer. He'd called her and said yes. He'd joined the Civilian Crisis Intervention Program, specifically the Veteran Peer Support Initiative. The training was intensive, covering everything from crisis de-escalation to suicide prevention to legal boundaries of civilian involvement. Jason threw himself into it with a focus he hadn't felt since leaving the Marines, discovering that he had a natural aptitude for the work. His own struggles gave him insight into the minds of people in crisis, and his military training provided the discipline needed to remain calm when situations escalated. He began accompanying officers on calls, and within weeks he'd talked down 3 separate veterans from various crisis points. The night before Alex and Emma were scheduled to return permanently to New Mexico with their mother, there was a gathering at the Montgomery home, a kind of informal farewell party. Officer Chen brought Rex. Margaret attended with a stack of paperwork ensuring the children's continued counseling and support, and Officer Hartley came to present the twins with honorary junior police officer badges, a gesture that made both children beam with pride. Jason brought gifts he'd carefully selected. For Alex, a journal where he could write or draw about his feelings, and for Emma, a photo album with pictures from their time in Flagstaff, including several of her with Rex. "I don't want to go," Emma said quietly as the evening wound down, sitting next to Jason on the porch steps while adults talked inside. "I want to stay here with you and Rex and Officer Chen." Jason put his arm around her small shoulders. "I know change is scary, but you're going home to your mom and she loves you so much. She's going to keep you safe." Emma leaned against him. "But what if we need you? What if something bad happens again?" Jason pulled out his phone. "See this? This is my number. Your mom has it too. If you ever need to talk, if you're scared or sad or just want to say hi, you can call me anytime. I promise I'll answer." Alex joined them on the steps, sitting on Jason's other side. "Will you visit us?" he asked. Jason nodded. "Absolutely. New Mexico isn't that far. I'll come visit, and maybe you can come back here sometimes too. This isn't goodbye forever. It's just see you later." The concept seemed to help both children, the idea that their connections weren't being severed completely. That night, after everyone else had left and Jason was driving back to the apartment he'd rented month to month, he realized something profound had shifted inside him. The emptiness that had defined his existence for 2 years had been filled. Not completely, but enough that he felt something approximating hope. The next morning, Jason stood in the driveway of the Montgomery home as Sharon loaded the twins' few possessions into her car. Alex and Emma had already said their goodbyes to Mrs. Montgomery and the other children, and now they stood facing Jason, their expressions a mixture of sadness and tentative excitement. "You're going to do great," Jason told them. "Both of you. You're the bravest kids I've ever met." Alex surprised him by stepping forward and hugging him tightly. "Thank you for hearing us," he whispered. "When we were in that room, I thought nobody could hear us screaming. But you did. You heard us when we needed someone most." Emma hugged him next, then reached up to touch his face with her small hand. You're a hero, Mr. Jason. You saved us. Jason's eyes stung. You saved yourselves by staying strong. I just made a phone call. But Emma shook her head. No. You cared when you didn't have to. Daddy always said nobody cared about us, that we didn't matter. But you showed us that wasn't true. The simple statement, delivered with a child's directness, broke something loose in Jason's chest. He knelt down to their level one last time. You matter. You've always mattered. Don't ever let anyone tell you different. As Sharon's car pulled away, heading south toward New Mexico in a new beginning, Jason stood watching until it disappeared from view. Officer Chen pulled up in his patrol car, Rex visible in the back. Heard they were leaving today, Chen said, getting out. Thought you might want some company. Jason nodded, grateful for the gesture. Rex emerged from the car and immediately moved to Jason's side, the dog's solid presence comforting. How you doing? Chen asked. Jason considered the question. Better than I expected. Still hurts, but it's a good hurt if that makes sense. Like proof that I can still feel something. Chen smiled. Makes perfect sense. You did good work here, Mercer. Changed those kids' lives. Changed your own too, from what I can see. Jason couldn't deny it. The man who checked into the Desert Rose Motel 3 weeks ago, empty and directionless, barely resembled the man standing here now. He still had PTSD, still had nightmares, still struggled with hypervigilance and anxiety, but he also had purpose. He had connections. He had proof that his existence mattered, that he could make a positive impact. Hartley tells me you've been impressive in the peer support program, Chen continued. 3 successful interventions already, and the veterans you've helped are all still engaged with services. That's a hell of a track record. Over the following months, Jason's life took on new shape and meaning. He continued with the crisis intervention program, specializing in veteran outreach. His own struggles with PTSD became tools he could use to connect with others fighting similar battles, and he discovered a gift for reaching people in their darkest moments. He returned to therapy, this time engaging fully rather than just going through the motions, working through his trauma instead of running from it. He even reconnected with his family, a tentative phone call to his mother that led to a visit, to conversations long overdue, to the beginning of healing old wounds. Alex and Emma called regularly, their voices growing stronger and more confident with each conversation. They were thriving in New Mexico with Sharon, engaged in trauma therapy, making friends at a new school, slowly building a normal childhood from the ruins of what they'd experienced. They sent Jason pictures, Emma with a real dog their mother had adopted, Alex holding up a certificate for perfect attendance, both of them grinning at the camera with smiles that reached their eyes. Officer Chen arranged a visit where he drove Rex to New Mexico for a weekend reunion, and the joy on the twins' faces when they saw the German Shepherd again was captured in photos that Jason kept on his phone. The first anniversary of the Desert Rose Motel incident arrived on a clear September evening. Jason stood in that same parking lot, looking at room 6 with its fresh paint and new door. The evidence of that night erased physically if not from memory. Officer Hartley had arranged for a small gathering, Chen and Rex, Margaret from CPS, Dr. Foster from the hospital, Mrs. Montgomery, and Sharon with Alex and Emma, who had made the trip specifically for this occasion. It was an informal memorial of sorts, acknowledging what had happened and celebrating how far everyone had come since that night. I want to thank all of you, Sharon said, her arms around her children, who stood close but no longer with the desperate cleaning of trauma. You saved my babies and gave us a chance to rebuild our family. Jason, you heard them when they thought no one was listening. Officer Chen, your Rex gave them comfort when they couldn't trust humans. Officer Hartley, you and your team acted decisively when seconds mattered. Margaret, you found resources and support we desperately needed. You're all part of our story now. The good part. The part where heroes showed up. The children nodded in agreement, Alex and Emma looking healthy, their cheeks filled out, their eyes clear. Alex spoke up, his voice stronger than it had been a year ago. Mr. Jason told us once that he knew what it was like to hide from someone who should have protected you, and that it wasn't our fault what happened. That helped me understand that I wasn't bad, that something bad happened to me, but it didn't make me bad. I think about that whenever I have a hard day. Emma added quietly, and Rex taught us that not everyone is scary, that some people just want to help. I was so scared of everyone at first, but Rex was patient and gentle, and it made me brave enough to trust the other good people around us. Officer Chen knelt down to Emma's level, Rex at his side. You know what? You taught Rex something too. You taught him that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept help when you need it, that reaching out, even when you're scared, can change everything. Emma hugged Rex, burying her face in his fur for a moment, then straightened up with a smile. The evening continued with lighter conversation, stories shared, updates exchanged. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the group stood together, an unlikely family forged in crisis and bound by shared experience. As people began to leave, heading to their separate lives and homes, Jason lingered behind with Officer Chen and Rex. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you'd kept driving that night?" Chen asked. "If you'd stopped at a different motel, or if you'd decided those sounds weren't your problem?" Jason had wondered that often. "All the time. Makes me think about all the times before when maybe I should have stopped and didn't. All the situations I walked away from because I convinced myself I was too broken to help." He looked at Chen. "But also makes me grateful that this time I didn't walk away." Chen nodded. "That's the thing about trauma and recovery. It's not linear. You don't just fix yourself and move on. But sometimes, in helping others, we help ourselves. Your connection with those kids, your work with other veterans, that's all part of your healing too. You're not just saving others, Jason. You're saving yourself at the same time." The insight resonated deeply. Jason realized that the man he'd been when he'd checked into that motel, isolated and convinced he had nothing to offer, had been fundamentally transformed by choosing to act, choosing to care, choosing to stay involved even when it was difficult. Rex nudged Jason's hand with his nose, and Jason scratched behind the dog's ears. "This guy's getting older," Chen observed. "He's got maybe 2 more years of active duty in him before retirement. Been thinking about what comes next for him." Jason looked at the German Shepherd with new understanding. "What happens to police dogs when they retire?" Chen smiled. "Usually their handlers adopt them and they live out their golden years in a home where they're loved and cared for. But I've got 3 other dogs already and my wife says the house is full. Been trying to find the right placement for Rex when the time comes." The implication hung in the air and Jason felt something click into place. "You think I could... would I be eligible to adopt him?" Chen's smile widened. "Been hoping you'd ask. Rex bonded with you that first night, same as he did with the twins. He sees something in you, recognizes you as someone worth protecting, worth supporting. When he retires, I can't think of a better home for him than with you. You'd be good for each other." The idea took root in Jason's mind, growing into something that felt right. A few years down the road, when Rex's working days were behind him, the dog would have a permanent home with someone who understood his value, his contribution, his worth. In the months that followed, Jason's work with the Crisis Intervention Program expanded. He became a certified peer support specialist, working not just with veterans, but with anyone experiencing trauma-related crisis. His apartment walls filled with letters and photos from people he'd helped, testimonials to the power of shared experience and genuine connection. He'd gone back to school part-time, studying psychology and social work, building on his natural abilities with formal education. The nightmares still came sometimes, and the hypervigilance never fully disappeared, but they were manageable now, part of his history rather than his entire identity. Alex and Emma continued to thrive, their progress documented in regular video calls and visits. They'd started speaking publicly about their experience, age-appropriately, in school presentations about safety and asking for help. Sharon had become an advocate for child welfare reform, working to ensure that cases like hers, where a parent frantically searched for kidnapped children, received more immediate and coordinated response. The family had transformed their trauma into purpose, channeling their pain into preventing others from suffering similarly. It was a pattern Jason recognized in his own life, the way survival could become advocacy, the way healing could include helping others heal. Officer Hartley's veteran peer support program became a model that other police departments around the country began replicating. Jason was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences about his experience, about the value of connecting crisis victims with peer supporters who truly understood their struggles. He spoke about that night at the Desert Rose Motel, about how close he'd come to doing nothing, about how Alex and Emma had saved him as surely as he'd helped save them. The story resonated, and Jason found himself at the center of a growing movement to integrate trauma survivors into crisis response systems. 2 years after that initial incident, Jason received a call from Officer Chen. Rex's retirement was official, the ceremony scheduled for the following month. "If you're still interested in adopting him, the paperwork can start now," Chen said. Jason didn't hesitate. "Absolutely, let's do it." The adoption process was straightforward, Jason's work with the police department and his history with Rex making him an ideal candidate. When the day came to officially bring Rex home, Alex, Emma, and Sharon made the trip from New Mexico to be present, the children wanting to be there when their first comfort animal found his forever home with their friend. The ceremony was held at the police station, a formal affair recognizing Rex's years of service and successful operations. But the most meaningful moment came after, when Officer Chen handed Jason the leash and said, "He's yours now. Take care of him, and he'll take care of you. That's always been the deal with Rex." Jason knelt down and Rex moved into position beside him, the familiar gesture now carrying different meaning. This wasn't a working dog offering professional support. This was a companion choosing his person, recognizing in Jason a kindred spirit, a fellow survivor who understood the weight of service and the scars of trauma. Alex and Emma sat on the floor, petting Rex and talking to him about all the adventures he'd have with Jason. "You'll be happy here," Emma told the dog seriously. "Mr. Jason knows how to listen, and he understands when you're sad. He helped us, and now you'll help him." The observation, coming from a now 8-year-old who'd grown wiser than her years, made the adults in the room exchange emotional glances. Children who'd endured what these twins had experienced often developed insight beyond their age, a gift born of suffering that allowed them to see truths others might miss. Jason felt grateful for their presence, for their continued role in his life, for the reminder that healing was possible. That evening, in the apartment that had become a real home rather than just a temporary stopping point, Jason sat on the couch with Rex settled at his feet, the dog's weight warm and reassuring against his leg. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the isolation and despair that had characterized his first years after leaving the Marines to this moment of connection and purpose. The transformation hadn't been linear or easy. He still had days where the PTSD symptoms flared, where the memories threatened to overwhelm him, where functioning felt impossible. But now he had tools, support, connections, and a reason to keep moving forward. Rex lifted his head and looked at Jason with those intelligent brown eyes that had seen so much, that had recognized trauma and responded with exactly what was needed. Jason reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" he said quietly. "Both of us carrying scars, both of us learning to live with them. But we're not alone anymore. That's the difference, buddy. We found each other, and we found people who care. That's enough. That's more than enough." Rex's tail thumped against the floor in agreement, and Jason smiled, a genuine expression of contentment that would have been unimaginable 3 years ago. The story of Jason, Rex, and the twins became something of a legend within the crisis intervention community. It was cited in training materials as an example of how peer support could work, how connections formed in trauma could facilitate healing, how animals could bridge gaps that humans sometimes couldn't. But for those directly involved, it wasn't a case study or a training example. It was their life, their reality, their shared journey from darkness toward light. Alex and Emma grew up knowing they had an extended family of heroes who'd been there on their worst night and had stayed through the recovery that followed. Years later, when Alex was 16 and contemplating his future, he'd tell people he wanted to be a crisis counselor to help other kids who'd been through trauma. Emma, at the same age, would talk about training therapy dogs, recognizing the unique role animals could play in healing. Both would credit Jason, Rex, and the team that had rescued them with not just saving their lives, but showing them that survival was only the beginning, that the real work was in building something meaningful from the ruins of what had been destroyed. Their mother Sharon would watch them with pride, knowing they'd taken their pain and transformed it into purpose. Jason, now in his early 40s and working full-time as a licensed therapist specializing in PTSD, would sometimes think back to that night at the Desert Rose Motel and marvel at the chain of events that had unfolded from a single decision to not ignore the sounds of distress. He'd been at his lowest point, convinced he had nothing to offer anyone, believing his trauma had rendered him useless. But in choosing to act, in calling for help, in showing up for 2 terrified children, he'd begun his own healing. The therapist who'd told him years ago that sometimes the way through trauma was to help others had been right, though he hadn't been able to hear it at the time. Rex lived to be 14, spending his final years in quiet comfort with Jason, visiting regularly with now teenage Alex and Emma, who'd never forgotten the German Shepherd who'd been their first glimpse of safety in a terrifying world. When Rex passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the people who'd loved him, the funeral was attended by dozens of people whose lives he'd touched over his career in retirement. Officer Chen spoke about the dog's dedication and intuition, his uncanny ability to know who needed him most. Jason spoke about companionship and healing, about how Rex had chosen him when he'd needed choosing, had stayed when he'd needed staying, had simply been present through the difficult work of recovery. The twins, now young adults making their own way in the world, spoke at Rex's funeral about the night that had changed their lives, about how a dog had known they needed gentleness when adults seemed like threats, about how that connection had given them the courage to trust again. "Rex taught us that protection doesn't always look like force," Alex said. "Sometimes it looks like a dog sitting quietly beside you, not asking for anything, just letting you know you're not alone." Emma added, "And he gave us Mr. Jason, who showed us that people who've been hurt can still help others, that our scars don't define us, that healing is possible even when it seems impossible." Jason stood at the back of the gathering, listening to the testimonials and stories, feeling the weight of loss but also the warmth of gratitude. Rex had been more than a pet or even a partner. He'd been a catalyst, a bridge, a teacher. In those moments after the Desert Rose Motel incident, when Jason had sat with Alex and Emma and Rex had positioned himself to comfort them all, something profound had shifted. Four traumatized beings, two children, one man, one dog, had found each other in crisis and had formed bonds that would last lifetimes. The dog was gone now, but the connections remained, the lessons endured, the healing continued. In the years that followed, Jason's work continued to expand. He opened a private practice that specialized in trauma recovery, often incorporating animal-assisted therapy in memory of Rex. He trained other therapists, published research on peer support models, and remained active in the crisis intervention program that had given him purpose when he'd needed it most. He maintained close relationships with Alex, Emma, and Sharon, celebrating milestones, offering support during difficult times, remaining a constant presence in their lives. Officer Chen retired and started a program training therapy dogs specifically for trauma victims, honoring Rex's legacy by preparing other animals for similar work. Officer Hartley became police chief and made trauma-informed policing a cornerstone of her department's approach, implementing protocols that recognize the humanity in crisis situations and prioritize connection over force whenever possible. Margaret from CPS became a regional director, using her position to reform how the system responded to child welfare cases, ensuring that situations like Alex and Emma's received coordinated, immediate attention. Dr. Foster continued her work with traumatized children, often referring families to Jason's practice when peer support seemed appropriate. The Desert Rose Motel was eventually purchased and renovated, becoming a transitional housing facility for homeless veterans. The tragedy that had occurred there transformed into ongoing support for those in need. Sometimes, late at night in his home office surrounded by evidence of a life rebuilt, Jason would think about the man he'd been when he'd pulled into that motel parking lot so many years ago. That man had been empty, directionless, convinced he had nothing left to give. He'd been running from his trauma, isolating himself, slowly disappearing into a fog of depression and PTSD. But in choosing to act when he heard children in distress, in making a phone call that would alter multiple lives, in showing up and staying involved when it would have been easier to walk away, that man had begun the process of reclaiming himself. The children he'd helped rescue had, in a very real sense, rescued him in return. The story didn't have a simple ending because life rarely does. Jason still struggled with PTSD symptoms, still had nightmares, still experienced triggers that sent him back to Afghanistan in his mind. Alex and Emma still dealt with their childhood trauma, still had moments of fear and anxiety, still bore psychological scars that would never fully disappear. But they'd all learned to live with their scars, to integrate them into who they were rather than letting them define who they could become. They'd found purpose in their pain, meaning in their survival, connection in their shared understanding of what it meant to endure and overcome. When people asked Jason about the turning point in his recovery, he always told the same story. A rundown motel on a desert highway, muffled cries through a wall, and the decision to not ignore what he heard. He'd talk about two terrified children and a dog who'd known exactly what they needed, about officers who'd acted decisively and a social worker who'd fought for appropriate placement, about a mother who'd never stopped searching and a community that had rallied around a family in crisis. He'd explain how in helping others, he'd found a reason to help himself, how in showing up for Alex and Emma, he'd learned to show up for his own recovery. And always, without fail, he'd mention the lesson that had resonated most deeply through the entire experience, that we're never as broken as we think we are, never as beyond help as we fear, never as alone as we feel in our darkest moments. That sometimes what we need most is someone who understands our pain, because they've lived through their own version of it, someone who won't offer empty platitudes, but will sit with us in our suffering and say, I know this place, I've been here too, and I can show you the way out. That's what he'd needed when he'd checked into the Desert Rose Motel, though he hadn't realized it yet. And that's what he'd been able to offer Alex and Emma because of his own experience with trauma. The impact rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. People who heard the story were inspired to pay attention, to not ignore signs of distress, to trust their instincts when something seemed wrong. Veterans who'd been isolating reached out for help, encouraged by Jason's example that recovery was possible and that their experiences could become assets in helping others. Children in crisis were connected with peer supporters who understood their fear because they'd known their own version of it. Police departments implemented new protocols, recognizing that sometimes the most effective intervention came from someone who'd walked a similar path rather than a professional who knew it only from textbooks. The anniversary gathering at the old Desert Rose Motel, now the Veterans Transitional Housing Center, became an annual tradition. Current residents would join the original participants, Jason, Alex, Emma, Sharon, Officer Chen, Officer Hartley, Margaret, Dr. Foster, Mrs. Montgomery, and others whose lives had intersected that night, to mark the date and celebrate how far everyone had come. Stories would be shared, updates exchanged, newcomers welcomed into the extended family that had formed from crisis. There would be laughter and sometimes tears, remembering both the horror of what had happened and the beauty of what had emerged from it. At one such gathering, when Alex and Emma were in their 20s and starting their own careers in helping professions, Emma stood to speak. "I've been thinking about that night a lot lately," she began, her voice steady and strong, so different from the terrified whisper it had been when she'd first been brought out of that motel room. About how close we came to not being saved, how many things had to align perfectly for us to survive. Mr. Jason had to be at that specific motel at that specific time. He had to be someone who listened to his instincts instead of ignoring them. Officer Chen had to be on duty with Rex, who had to be a dog trained to detect exactly what we needed. Officer Hartley had to make the call to breach the door when she did. All of these pieces had to fall into place. She paused, looking around at the faces that had become family. But here's what I realized. Those pieces fall into place more often than we think if we're paying attention. There are people hurting everywhere all the time, and there are people capable of helping them if they choose to. The difference between tragedy and rescue often comes down to whether someone decides to act, whether they make the call, knock on the door, refuse to look away. Mr. Jason didn't know us. He had every reason to stay in his room and mind his own business. But he didn't. He heard us, and he acted, and that decision changed everything. Alex continued her thought. And what's amazing is that by helping us, he helped himself. By staying involved when he could have walked away, he found his own path to healing. That's the part people sometimes miss when they hear our story. They think it's about a hero saving kids, but it's actually about broken people helping each other become whole. We were all damaged that night. Me and Emma by our father's abuse, Mr. Jason by his war experiences, Rex by whatever he'd seen in his career, all the responders who'd dealt with too many traumas. We came together in that crisis and somehow made each other stronger. Jason listened to the twins speak, feeling pride and gratitude in equal measure. They'd grown into remarkable young adults, using their experiences to fuel their passion for helping others, rather than letting those experiences define them as victims. They understood something fundamental about trauma and recovery that many people never grasped, that healing wasn't about forgetting or moving on, but about integration and transformation, about taking the worst moments of your life and finding meaning in them, purpose through them, connection because of them. It was a lesson he'd learned alongside them, his own recovery intertwined with theirs in ways that would be impossible to untangle. As the evening wound down and people began departing, Jason found himself standing in the same spot where he'd stood years ago when he'd first heard the muffled cries that would change his life. The courtyard had been renovated, the cracked concrete replaced, the old pool filled and converted to a garden where current residents could sit in peace. But the essence of the place remained, a testament to the fact that darkness and light could coexist, that sites of tragedy could be reclaimed and transformed. He thought about the journey that had begun here, about the man he'd been and the man he'd become, about the unexpected grace of being in the right place at the right time, with just enough courage to act. Officer Chen joined him, and they stood together in comfortable silence, two men who'd found unexpected friendship through shared commitment to service. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you'd driven past that night?" Chen asked. Jason had pondered that question countless times. All the time. But then I remember what my therapist told me once, that there are no coincidences in recovery, only opportunities to choose differently than we have before. I'd been choosing isolation and avoidance for 2 years. That night, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I chose connection and action instead. Everything that followed came from that one choice. Chen nodded slowly. "And Rex chose you just as surely as you chose to help those kids. He saw something in you that night, recognized you as someone worth staying close to, worth protecting. Dogs have a sense about these things that we humans often lack. They see past the surface damage to the essential person underneath. Rex knew you were someone special long before you knew it yourself." The observation resonated deeply. Jason had often felt that Rex had seen him more clearly than he'd seen himself, had recognized potential and strength that Jason had believed were long gone. In serving as Jason's companion through the hardest years of recovery, Rex had given him a gift beyond measure. The experience of being known fully and accepted completely, damage and all. The desert night settled around them, stars emerging in a sky unpolluted by city lights, the temperature dropping from day's heat to evening's cool. Jason thought about all the pieces of his life that had led to this moment, the pain and loss and struggle, but also the connection, purpose, and meaning he'd found. He thought about Alex and Emma tucked safely in their lives, about the veterans he'd helped through crisis, about the therapeutic practice he'd built, about the family he'd reconnected with, about the community he'd become part of. None of it would have happened if he'd ignored those cries, if he'd convinced himself it wasn't his problem, if he'd chosen isolation over involvement. "I'm grateful," Jason said suddenly, the words surprising him with their simplicity and truth. "For all of it, even the hard parts. Because the hard parts led here, and here's pretty damn good." Chen smiled. "That's the thing about trauma that people don't always understand. It doesn't have to be the end of your story. It can be the middle, the part where things get really bad before they get better. But it doesn't have to be where the story ends. You get to write the next chapters, and sometimes they're even better because you know what it cost to get there, what it took to survive and rebuild and find meaning again." The wisdom in those words settled over Jason like a benediction. They stood together a while longer, two men who dedicated their lives to crisis response and recovery, watching as the last few gathering participants drove away into the night. The Veterans Transitional Housing Center's lights glowed warmly, a beacon for those who needed it, a symbol of hope built on the site of past tragedy. Inside, men and women who'd served their country and lost their way were being given a chance to rebuild, supported by people who understood their struggles because they'd faced similar ones. It was a fitting legacy for what had happened here, a transformation from darkness to light that honored everyone who'd been part of that original story. As Jason finally turned to leave, heading toward his truck and the life waiting beyond this moment, he paused for one last look at the place where everything had changed. In the darkness, he could almost see them. A younger version of himself, uncertain and isolated, two terrified children huddled in fear, a dog with the wisdom to know exactly what was needed, officers prepared to risk themselves for strangers, a dedicated social worker fighting for the right placement, a mother's desperate love, a community's willingness to care. All of it had converged here, in this unremarkable stretch of desert highway, in a rundown motel that should have been just another anonymous stop in a directionless journey. But there were no coincidences in recovery, only opportunities to choose differently. Jason had chosen to listen that night, to act, to stay involved even when it would have been easier to walk away. And in making that choice, he'd saved more than two children from immediate danger. He'd saved himself from a future of isolation and despair. He'd saved Officer Chen from the regret of an unresolved case. He'd saved Sharon from losing her children forever. He'd given Alex and Emma not just their lives, but hope for their futures. And Rex, in his final years of service before retirement, had been given the opportunity to make a profound difference in the lives of three traumatized souls who desperately needed exactly what he could provide. The story that had begun in violence and terror had evolved into something beautiful and redemptive, proof that human beings are capable of profound resilience and that healing is possible even from the most devastating wounds. It was a story about the power of connection, the importance of acting when instinct says someone needs help, the value of peer support, and the remarkable ability of animals to bridge gaps that words cannot cross. It was a story about transformation and second chances, about how the darkest moments can become catalysts for positive change if we're brave enough to engage with them rather than run from them. And as Jason drove away from the Veterans Transitional Housing Center, heading home to the life he'd rebuilt piece by careful piece, he carried with him the lessons learned in that motel courtyard years ago, that we're never as alone as we think we are, never as broken as we fear, never as beyond redemption as we might believe, that sometimes what we need most is someone who understands our pain because they've lived their own version of it, someone willing to sit with us in our darkness and say, "I see you, I hear you, you matter, and I'm not going anywhere." That's what he'd needed. That's what he'd been able to offer. And that exchange, repeated countless times since in his work and life, had made all the difference in the world.